On a quiet Sunday morning, 353 Japanese aircraft roared toward a naval base that never saw them coming. In less than 2 hours, the United States Pacific Fleet would be shattered. Over 2,400 Americans would be dead, and a nation that wanted no part of war would be dragged into the deadliest conflict in human history. This is the story of December 7th, 1941, the day that changed everything. Japan's leadership faced an impossible choice. American oil embargoes were strangling their war machine in China, and every month of delay made Japan weaker. Admiral Yamamoto, who had studied at Harvard and understood America's industrial might better than anyone, proposed a desperate gamble: destroy the U.S. Pacific Fleet in a single, devastating strike before America could fully mobilize. For months, Japanese planners studied Pearl Harbor obsessively. Spies photographed ship movements. Pilots trained relentlessly for shallow-water torpedo runs, a technique many experts believed was impossible in Pearl Harbor's harbor depth. Every detail was rehearsed until the operation became second nature, precision built on deception. On November 26, 1941, a strike force of 6 aircraft carriers slipped out of Japanese waters under strict radio silence. Carrying over 400 aircraft, this fleet crossed thousands of miles of open Pacific Ocean completely undetected. American intelligence had no idea this armada existed. Meanwhile, life at Pearl Harbor continued in blissful ignorance. Sailors polished decks. Planes sat wingtip to wingtip on airfields to guard against sabotage, a decision that would prove catastrophic. Nobody believed Japan capable of striking so far from home. Complacency had settled over America's Pacific stronghold. At 6 a.m. on December 7th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft launched from their carriers 230 miles north of Oahu. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters climbed into the pre-dawn sky. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led them, radioing the now infamous phrase confirming total surprise had been achieved. 7:48 a.m. the first bombs fell. Battleship Row, 7 massive American warships lined up in a row, became an instant target. Sailors below deck had no warning. Many were still asleep when the first explosions tore through steel hulls that had never faced real combat. The USS Arizona suffered the single deadliest blow of the entire attack. A bomb pierced her forward ammunition magazine, triggering a catastrophic explosion that split the ship apart. In seconds, 1,177 sailors and Marines were killed. Nearly half of all American deaths that day happened on this one ship. The USS Oklahoma capsized within minutes after being struck by multiple torpedoes. Hundreds of sailors were trapped inside the overturned hull, some tapping desperately on the metal walls for days, as rescuers worked frantically to cut them free. Only a fraction survived the ordeal. Japanese torpedo bombers skimmed just feet above the harbor's shallow water, releasing weapons specially modified with wooden fins to prevent them from burying in the mud. This technical innovation, once thought impossible, turned Pearl Harbor's calm waters into a killing field. On the airfields, rows of American planes parked wing to wing were annihilated before a single one could take off. Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows fields burned. Nearly 190 American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. The anti-sabotage formation had become a death trap. Amid the chaos, individual acts of desperate courage emerged. Sailors manned anti-aircraft guns barefoot and in pajamas. Doris Miller, a mess attendant with no weapons training, grabbed an anti-aircraft gun and fired at Japanese planes, later earning the Navy Cross for his bravery. By 8:25 a.m., a brief lull gave sailors a false sense that the worst was over. Then the second wave struck. 170 more aircraft targeting ships and installations that had survived the first assault. The attack would not fully end until nearly 9:45 a.m. When the smoke cleared, the devastation was staggering. 4 battleships sunk, 4 more damaged. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and hundreds of aircraft destroyed or crippled. 2,403 Americans dead, another 1,178 wounded. Japan had achieved a tactical masterpiece, but at a terrible strategic cost. Remarkably, Japan's attack missed the 3 American aircraft carriers, which happened to be at sea that day. This single stroke of luck would prove decisive. Carriers, not battleships, would define the naval war that followed, and America still had them. The morning after, Pearl Harbor was a graveyard of twisted steel and oil-slicked water. Rescue crews worked around the clock, pulling survivors from capsized hulls. The air still stank of smoke and burning fuel. Nothing about the base looked the same as it had 24 hours earlier. On December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Within hours, the United States formally declared war on Japan. The isolationist mood that had gripped America for years evaporated overnight. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, honoring their alliance with Japan. What began as a regional conflict in the Pacific instantly became a truly global war, with America now fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously. Yamamoto himself had reportedly warned his superiors that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but ultimately had no chance of winning a prolonged war against America's industrial capacity. His prediction would prove eerily, tragically accurate. Not every casualty of December 7th happened on Battleship Row. Smaller vessels moored along the docks were caught in the same firestorm, their hulls scorched black, superstructures twisted by heat that melted steel. For the sailors stationed on these lesser-known ships, survival often came down to seconds and pure chance. In the days after the attack, salvage crews returned to the harbor floor again and again. Divers worked in near-zero visibility, feeling their way through twisted metal and oil-slicked wreckage to recover the dead. Ships once thought beyond saving, like the West Virginia and California, were painstakingly raised, repaired, and eventually sent back into battle. It was grim, exhausting work, but also the first step toward turning tragedy into resolve. Pearl Harbor is not just a story of loss, it is the story of a sleeping giant that woke up angry. 80 years later, the rusted hull of the Arizona still rests beneath these waters, a memorial to 1,177 men entombed where they fell. Their sacrifice reminds us that peace is never guaranteed. It is defended, one generation at a time, by those willing to answer when it's called for.